So today, Scott and Martine will be discussing how AI is rewriting the rules of SaaS monetization. So we'll kick off on how that shift is happening. We'll go into the investor lens on get Martine's perspective on what great monetization looks like and the patterns he's seeing across the market. From there, we'll talk about how AI companies can better define and capture value, turn pricing into a true operating model, and then we'll wrap up with some practical advice on how startups can scale it the right way. And with that, I'll hand it over to Scott to kick things off.
Hello, nice to meet you, or nice to meet everyone here. Super excited to welcome Martine onto the webinar. Martine has been on our board since, for at least 4 or 5 years at this point, and is one of the kind of key, I would say, like voices on how infra and AI are intersecting in this current moment. And I think he has a ton of very interesting thoughts around pricing and thinking like an investor in this moment. I think there's like a lot of very interesting kind of rabbit holes we can go down, and I look forward to going down them with him. But with that, maybe Martine, do a quick intro for folks, and then I'll jump into a little bit of a vignette on Metronome, and then we can jump right into the conversation.
Well, first off, that beautiful image is definitely pre-COVID. It was probably 10 years ago.
So pre-startup, maybe.
Pre-startup. So I appreciate you putting it up there, but things have evolved then. So hey, listen, I appreciate the time from everybody. So I'm Martine. I run the infrastructure fund at Andreessen Horowitz. I did my PhD at Stanford in computer science in infra. I was in networking. And then I started a company, and I was a portfolio founder for Andreessen Horowitz. So Ben Horowitz was actually on my board. We sold that to VMware. We were kind of the first unicorn exit, like coming out of the recession in infrastructure. So that was a $1 billion exit. And by the time I left VMware, that year that I left, it was a $1 billion business, $1 billion a year. And then I joined 10 years ago, Andreessen Horowitz, to run the infrastructure fund. And so I've been here for 10 years. I sit on a bunch of boards, names that you probably know, Fivetran, Cursor, a lot of the big labs. And so I'm very, very excited to be here.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, let me, I'll do a quick intro about Metronome, and then we'll jump straight into the conversation. So for those of you who don't know, Metronome, we power essentially monetization infrastructure for some of the fastest growing AI native companies and also some very large enterprise SaaS businesses. Our core value roughly is we make it really easy to price and package however you want and make sure that you can get your AI products into market as quickly as possible while making sure that everything is exactly accurate behind the scenes. And I think the other key thing I will say before I turn it over to Martine for some questions is that one of the key things that we understand here at Metronome, and we believe very deeply, is that like right now there's a lot of talk about usage-based billing, outcome-based billing, all these like kind of billing models. But the reality is that the problem that billing represents is actually much deeper. It's actually much more of a workflow problem. It's much more of a customer experience problem. It's much more of a like, how do you architect a business around a monetization model rather than just like, okay, how do I actually make sure that like my invoice looks correct at the end of the month? And so we've built Metronome to kind of service all of those needs. And actually that kind of takes me to the first question that I have for Martine, and one that I think is really interesting is, I think you built Nicira in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and then you worked at VMware. I think everyone would say that like AI is a wave, and I am curious how you view the monetization, like where we are in the monetization journey of this AI wave. Like I think one of the things that I would observe about social media is like Facebook for a very long time didn't make any money; it just like ran at a loss. And so actually, where are we in the like maturity curve of AI as an industry in terms of monetization, and how does it differ from prior generations that you've seen?
Okay, so it feels like every platform epoch, we have to think about kind of pricing and billing and how we value software, right? And so when I started my company in infrastructure, we're still in the perpetual days, right? So you'd sell someone like software or a box, and they'd pay you some money, and then you'd leave. And then you got to come back in a couple of years and try and sell them another box, and then hopefully like you had a new better box or whatever. And so from when we started this era to after I left, the industry had gone through kind of the SaaS revolution and gone to recurring. And the view was like, we're going to deliver software as a service, and then we're going to build from recurring, and you get all of the upgrades that you want from that. And so, I had a number of learnings from those. One of those is like these tend to be customer aligned. Like you do this because it's actually better for like the user, better for the customer. But the second thing is you have to like redo your entire business this way. Everything from go to market to sales comp to how you value features to, I mean, like it cuts through the entire business. And we actually had to come up with an entire new playbook in order to deal with recurring. And I know that, Scott, you were in the industry as well. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that. But going forward, so I think we're having a similar shift now as we go from kind of traditional seat-based recurring to usage-based. There was kind of smatterings of that in infrastructure before. I'm an infrastructure guy, like you think kind of like cloud credits, but now it's everything. And this one is much bigger, much faster, and much more furious than the one before. And it just tends to be a lot more strategic because it's so closely bound to the actual usage and value that it gets. And so again, we're having to rethink everything. I think we're in quite early days to your question. I actually think, I mean, listen, in some ways I feel like I'm talking to Fermi about physics. Like you actually are one of the world's experts. And so I would really love for you to kind of dig in. And I love to like kind of spring it with the anecdotes that I say from the board, from you to dig in and how you're seeing it.
Great.
The key considerations each company should do. But I will say from my perspective as a board member, as an investor, if we're in the AI space, a company is not considering usage-based billing, it's a conversation I will force very quickly because it is so fun. It is so fundamental to the business, and it is so strategic. So.
Yeah, totally. Actually, so I think you mentioned it, but like before this, I worked at Dropbox, and in a way, I think Dropbox was one of the vanguard companies for this seat subscription business model. So I'll give a little bit of an anecdote, and then I turn the question on you. So one of the things that I observed very quickly is that our monetization model at Dropbox for the Teams product scaled with the number of users, and so like the number of people in your company, like was essentially your value metric or how your monetization scaled. What this led to was like wall-to-wall selling, where you would basically try to get as fast as possible to distribute across as many different people, kind of logging into the network of your Dropbox instance. And so one of the interesting observations of that business model was that we spent a lot of time reducing the friction for bringing an incremental user onto the platform, both in the web UI, but also support for every operating system, and making sure that every operating system kind of like continued through end of life. And so, there's a lot of like really great Dropboxers who spent like endless years making sure that like every version of Windows like was supported to like the 9th degree, because that was how they monetized. So that was like, the monetization model dictated the product strategy, and those two things were deeply tied. One of the interesting things, though, is how much a user used your product had nothing to do with monetization. Like it's like if a user stored 1 trillion gigabytes or 1 gigabyte or 0, you actually made the exact same amount of money. In fact, your incentives were kind of weirdly perverse, where your cost scaled as the amount of data that is stored, but you recoup nothing. And so what that led to is this kind of it's like there's a reason why Dropbox is famous for its like virality and network, like essentially expansion, but also you could say the value, no offense, Drew, if you're listening, hasn't really changed in the past 15 years for any one user in that product. And that's actually, I think, a good, to me, that was like an object lesson in business model is destiny. And so I would love to hear your take on some of these more AI native companies and how that intersection between product strategy and business model is playing out in these companies that are based on top of these LLMs. Like I'd be super curious to hear you just like reason through it. I'll maybe take an example or an abstracted example, but I would love to hear your thoughts on if you have an equivalent story for like some of these AI native companies.
Yeah, well, so I think the thing that's so remarkable about AI is how much it actually changes the cost structure for the user. There's actually two ways. One that's kind of not answering your question. The other one that is answering your question. The one that's not answering your question is I don't remember in the history of the industry where you could take a company and actually pour money into it, and it could make use of that money early on, right? Like in the past, like you'd pour money into a company, they'd hire a whole bunch of engineers, and then they would like build something really complex and it wouldn't work, right? But with AI, you can pour money into these companies and you train a model, and that model is incredibly useful, right? And so in some ways, companies have become these receptacles of putting large amounts of money, and that's actually turned into revenue on the other side with small teams. So it's a very, very different construction. But then you look at the other side of that. So what do these models mean to users? And again, I don't remember the last time that we had a product that was so close to actual value creation. So my favorite example is image. So I'm not going to talk LLMs. I'm going to talk something else because it's so much easier to reason about, right? So let's say that I wanted to create a Pixar image of me, right? In the pre-AI world, like I don't know, like I can't draw. So what do? I go hire somebody, and like let's say, what's it? It takes them a week because they're backlogged, and then what, $100, let's say, right? So if you compare that to the inference cost. What's the inference cost? 1/100th of a penny, right? So you've got 4 orders of magnitude difference, right? So you have got this very, very clear dislocation between what you could do before and what you can do now with a model, right? And so because you're bringing the marginal cost down so much, there's very direct value to the user. And this kind of necessitates different pricing because you could use it for an hour and you can get 4 orders of magnitude more value, or you could use it for a week. And I think necessarily the trade-off there is actually the COGS end up increasing for these companies, right? I mean, you've created kind of like a nuclear reactor that costs some amount to run. And so on one hand, there's tremendous amount of value. On the other hand, like it actually costs to run these things. And so it just kind of necessitates a different model, both, so you can kind of align yourself with kind of the customer value, but also so you can make decisions on how you run your business, on like how much do you want to like optimize for margin, for distribution, or things like that. And so it's just the symmetry between the value created versus the cost to serve it is so much different now than it was during the SaaS era. It's just really required these different business models. And that's why I think so many of these are going towards, the usage-based billing.
Well, so actually that kind of dovetails with, and because you mentioned cost, I have to ask the question. But sometimes people ask and they say, okay, like, they look at, I don't even know where they get this information, but they're basically like, this company is running at a loss. Like it's like a margin negative product. I guess you sit on the boards of some of the fastest growing companies in the history of the world. Talk to us a little bit about, or behind the curtain, like what is actually like, is that true? Is this stuff like running cost negative and then, or margin negative? And talk a little bit about like that kind of meme and like why, it either makes sense or is stupid.
Yeah. Okay. So before I was saying, like, listen, like you have this kind of nuclear fusion that you've created and that adds tremendous value. And so that it's just like a different set of primitives to work with as you build out your business, right? So you can make all sorts of choices that you want, right? I will say, and so now, like, people make different choices based on that. Sometimes they'll go for distribution, sometimes they'll go for margin. Unfortunately, we as an industry, every time that there is, a technical epoch, we have this weird schadenfreude where we always are like, oh, like these companies are margin negative or whatever. And we have that conversation without realizing that these are board level decisions where often they're quite intentional to do that. And the great thing about usage-based billing, and this is a knob that you can decide to turn up or down, right? So let me just go ahead and talk through this. Many of the guys, so I'm not going to say any specific companies, but we're in all the largest AI companies. So many of these companies, if you segment the business and you're like, okay, I'm going to look at just the enterprise revenue or like the enterprise and teams revenue, they're actually beautiful margins, right? They're gross margin positive, normally not software margins, but let's say 30 to 50%. They're actually great examples of AI companies at scale that have been profitable from day one that are hundreds of millions of revenue. So there's clearly proof points of like very profitable. But there are other ones where if you segment it on like, let's say, enterprise and teams, it's gross margin positive. But if you look at like free plans and, maybe pro plans or the GPM tier, it's negative or the entire thing blended pencils out to zero. And so, okay, so what conclusion can we draw from that? Well, if you have a situation like that, I guarantee, because I'm in these conversations, the board was like, listen, what's more important to us is distribution, not margins. And what's amazing about usage-based billing, by the way, what's amazing about this epoch is like you actually have that level of granularity and control. Like you can view pricing very strategically, much more than during the SaaS days, by the way, because this stuff is just so useful. It kind of solves retention problems. So you can at the board and say, listen, we're going to kind of give away this many tokens or this much stuff over here. We're going to pencil out blended to zero. Over here, we've got great margins. And at any point in time, if we want, we can kind of go ahead and like limit the free tier and go to a margin positive. And so, again, this is this kind of silly, stupid meme that happens every epoch. I mean, listen, it happened during the .com days when they actually weren't making any money. Here we are making any money. It's being applied now, but like the reality is it just really shows the flexibility that you have with these business models.
Yeah, and I think what you said is really important. Again, I think it's like I'll bring in a Dropbox analogy because I just know it so viscerally.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like we offered a free tier, okay? Like that
yeah.
obviously cost us money, like literally definitionally, right? And yet it was like it's like if you just looked at the free users, you'd be like, this product doesn't make any money. And yet the company was free cash flow positive for like,
Yeah,
98% of its existence. And
yeah.
and the reality is like the free tier in that case is serving as like lead gen for companies that are actually getting super deep value from it and then scaling
Right.
into
And
that.
and oh, by the way, like what a great lead gen mechanism it is. Like
100%. Yeah.
how many companies have just like literally pissed away money on like marketing that doesn't do anything, right? Like
100%.
having come from the SaaS era, let me tell you, like the most common discussion on the board is like, we have all these MQLs, that's great, you're beating your revenue. None of them are converting to SQL, so none of them are like actually converting
Exactly.
to wins, right? So there's this massive disconnect between marketing, general demand gen, and then lead gen, and then closed. And you would spend millions every year on this because the marketing was not aligned with actually product usage. Right? It was a totally different motion.
100%.
And here you actually have like this magic thing that you can give to people that actually draws
Yes.
them on the product journey from day zero. And so it's
Well,
almost like the most efficient
exactly.
marketing budget that any company has ever had. And then
100%.
and literally you just make a
100%.
decision to what extent, like you're like, okay, I'm gonna like grow distribution versus I'm gonna do conversions into sales. And so I just think like this kind of mimetic
100%.
view on margins is just doesn't understand what's actually
Well,
happening out there.
exactly. And it's even more, it's like, the other thing that's true is that when you capture these users, like attention is zero sum. And so if you can get them on your free
Totally.
product, then
Yeah.
basically you are training them on your model of the world and then getting
Yeah.
them in your ecosystem. And so I think it's like, again, turns out big businesses doing hundreds of millions of dollars, you can find a cohort of users that are margin negative. Okay, cool,
Yeah.
great. Thank you for that
Yeah.
useful information. I think
Yeah.
like the reality is that like yeah, it's like these businesses are like printing cash on day one. So actually that
Yeah.
kind of leads me to an interesting question because I did a startup in the early 2010s and it was like, the company getting to 100 million was like this insane milestone that just no
Yeah.
one ever got
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh
Yeah.
my God, you're a God if you can
Yeah.
do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, like, I mean, I still think it's a very impressive achievement, but it's being
Yeah.
achieved super fast.
Yeah.
What is different about the founders in this moment such that they can handle this? Like, or, like there's like, obviously the internet has
Yeah,
matured and
yeah,
like
no,
these
actually,
distribution
actually,
channels
let
have
me, let
matured,
me,
but
let
like,
me,
yeah,
let me work towards. So this is the right question, but let me work towards it with something that's very adjacent to what we were just talking about, which is, so our view as investors is that AI actually solves the customer acquisition problem beautifully,
mhm,
but it doesn't necessarily solve the retention problem. Actually,
mhm,
it doesn't necessarily solve the defensibility problem, right? And so, you've kind of got this hack that you can actually throw kind of pricing at to solve to get a bunch of users. But then there's this great question is like, okay, so how do you retain them? How do you stay defensible and things like that? And that is very much an evolving
mhm,
playbook. Like like right now, it
yeah,
seems that as far as I can tell, these markets are so big and growing so fast that brand moats are actually taking
mhm,
effect. Meaning, like it doesn't like I don't know, OpenAI may or may not be better than the others at like language, but it's the leader because people know it and my mom uses it, which is crazy, right? And
yeah,
Midjourney, which never took on any VC funding, is still kind of the leader in image, and everybody knows Cursor and is the leader in code. And so you've got things like brand effects that are taking over. To get these companies to scale. But then also these companies have to move to very much traditional modes, right? Like what are the traditional
mhm,
modes? Two-sided marketplaces, long tail integration modes, things like that. And so I think the dynamics we're seeing are the following, which is why this stuff gets so complicated. The first one, like we said, is you can throw money at the user acquisition problem. So you have these massive, like really quick growths. And then you have a separate motion, which is like, so how do you kind of retain those users once the brand goes away, right? And so you see like a lot of kind of product work in order to do that. And then you have this third one is because now you've got this hack for customer acquisition. Like, how do these teams actually, um, keep the companies running while this is going on? And this is going
yeah,
to allude to something I said previously, which is like there is a gift in all of the another gift in all of this AI is you could actually make very functional products with small teams. It's more of like almost like a science project than an engineering project. Engineering is incredibly hard to complicate. And so I think to scale, it's very hard to scale because it gets so complicated. So I think we're at a point where the industry where we understand the acquisition, we understand some of the defensibility. Part of that defensibility now is you have to go horizontal, which becomes a bit more of a product engineering and problem. And I think that's kind of where we are. Like if you even look at like OpenAI released Sora 2.0, right, recently. And if you actually look at it, like, was it the state of the art video model? Not really, but there was like a lot of product features on it. And so I think now exactly where we are is like we're in the product phase for things like retention, for things like verticalization. And I don't think we actually have a good answer, but I do know that right now these teams are forced to be more product teams than they had been in the past for exactly this reason.
Yeah. So, okay, this is super interesting because, like, okay, like,
And then
I hear you
by the way,
say,
I touched a whole bunch there, but I just wanted to make a point that like just because you've solved the customer acquisition problem does not mean you've
yes,
solved the defensibility retention problem.
well,
The companies are focused on that right now, and that's kind of pushes. I think this is where we are right now. Is right there.
Exactly.
Yeah,
They like, yes. And so actually now I'm super curious because in historic modes, you kind of are solving these problems kind of in parallel, like at the same time, right? And right now it's like, but you just like somehow got this like hundreds of millions of ARR overhang, which needs to renew next year and didn't exist last year. And so what is like, and I know you're working with some of the like some of the founders. I've met a number of them, and I've worked with some of the people who they're now hiring as their lieutenants, and these are like the smartest of the smart people, like just like the truly amazing humans. What are these companies doing differently in this phase? Because they're essentially compressing an entire company formation into like a freaking year. They're taking a decade and compressing it. I mean, and so like, how are these companies even doing this? Like, how are founders running these businesses? Like what, I mean, and obviously it's like an emergent thing.
Let's be clear, it's total mayhem out there.
Yes.
I mean, it's like, so let me give a bit of an analogy, which is before you would kind of build this complex product and nobody would use it. And so then you're kind of like lost in the forest, and you're kind of trying to find people to use it. And so like by the time people start using it, you have a fairly like mature R&D org and product org and this and that. Like that was kind of like the standard path before now. And so it's like, like this adage of like you're trying to like, fly the airplane while you're building it type thing. I mean, like, this is such a cliche, right? Now it feels to me is like what you did is like you took an airplane kit and then you launched it into the air. And now you've got to build it before it kind of it hits the ground. I mean, the saving grace is that AI is so magic that you do have users to work with, and you can A/B test your way into how you do it right if you keep things together, right? So the good news is, like, we're talking about usage-based billing. Like you're so close to like the customer value that you can really follow user behavior patterns to know what to build next. It's like you're not lost in the wood. It's more of kind of a strict execution problem. And I've found the teams that do the best here are very, very user focused, very, very usage focused, very customer focused. They build the obvious stuff because the customer acquisition problem has been solved. I mean, I think that's kind of what works the best. And then listen, I don't think we've seen the end of this story now because, we've got a bunch of leaders that are now branching out to a number of products. And every time it seems to me that there's going to be competition, the market just grows and fragments again. And so I think the story to date has just been fragmentation. So it's mostly white space. And until this market slows down, that's what we're going to see. And then the consolidation phase will look very different, right? I mean, let me just give you like just a quick historical anecdote on this. Remember, OpenAI was the first to image, right, with DALL-E?
Yeah.
But they lost that, right? And then they were the first to code with Copilot, really. And then, now they're not the lead there. And then they were the first to video with Sora, and they're not the lead there. But like they're the largest company by far with language, right? And so the conclusion that I take away from this is these markets are so big, you can't focus on a whole bunch of them. You kind of focus on one and you win that one. And I think while that's happening, you're just going to continue to see the companies that execute the fastest, that kind of win the white space, win. And then when things slow down and consolidate, we'll have a very, very new phase where it's going to be much, much more about kind of defensibility, sticking out the ground, and like competitive dynamics, et cetera.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think that general thesis of it's like, these spaces were all much bigger than any of us thought, or they're much more like there's so much more multifaceted. And obviously one way of winning a space is with product, and the other is through business model and monetization. So how do you think, like when you're talking with a portfolio company, how are you, like who are the key people to help a founder or a CEO reason through the like right way to turn that dial between like we should be distribution focused, we should be margin focused, like generally, like how are you, like what is the ideal setup in this moment, knowing that like if you get it right, it's like catching lightning in a bottle and the flywheel just spins incredibly fast. How are companies set up against this?
No, this is a super interesting question. So I've always viewed that company goes through 3 stages. There's the product stage, the sales stage, and the operations stage, right? And like you can't kind of skip phases, and the leadership is going to kind of align to the phase. And historically, the product phase is just about the product CEO or the product founders and kind of R&D and execution and whatever. And then you get to the sales phase, and the sales phase is when like basically the business side kind of kicked in. And so like when I was in the sales phase for my company, when we were going from 10 million to a billion, my closest business partner was the CFO, and the reason, or it was finance, and the reason that was is because literally like sales comp and marketing spend and going international and had partners, like that was like the heart of the business. And of course, when you go to operations, that's the case. So the biggest shift that I'm seeing, to answer your question, is finance is being pulled into the product phase. It's so interesting, right? Like you've never seen this be like, what is someone in finance going to do with like, early on with like while you're still building the product and finding product market fit. And the reality is because you do have this knob towards add value so much more directly, and it so directly impacts the running of the company, the things like the margins, like, even things like, do you, if you have like a new feature, like do you incent this by like investing money in it, by like giving it away or not? And so, I mean, I am seeing finance being pulled much more strategically, much more early. And finance has always been incredibly strategic for the business, but it was always in these last 2 phases. It was in the sales phase and in the operations phase, and now I'm seeing it in the product phase. And so, listen, you have product teams that are incredibly finance savvy. You've got R&D teams that are incredibly finance savvy. I mean, I work with companies, no joke, where the engineers themselves have dashboards on how much it costs for what they're working on. Does that make sense? So even as part of R&D, like kind of the billing is going through it. And so I think just finance has become much, much more strategic as a result of kind of this new epoch.
Do you think that like kind of, so it sounds like one way that companies are reacting is everyone
actually, can you answer? I actually love to hear your answer to the question that I just asked.
Well, so actually, it's interesting. I actually strongly agree with like, so one observation I've had is that like our engineering team, for instance, is like a lot more financially literate than any team ever was at Dropbox, like ever, crazy. Even at the like terminal phase of the company, except for like maybe the senior infra leader or something. And it's like they don't own a P&L, but they understand the P&L like in depth. And they're like, okay, this feature, I actually literally just yesterday saw a feature request for one of our largest customers. And like an engineer was bringing like, here's the COGS analysis of how it's going to take to serve this feature. And I talked to the PM and we think we can charge X. And I'm like, oh my God, like what? This is coming from engineering. Like, cool. Like working as intended, I guess. Like that's it. And I think it's exactly goes back to this idea that like, when you're in a consumption business, like you're just talking about value, and then you're talking about value splitting between you and the customer. But like everyone should be obsessed with value. Like it's like it's everyone's job to like be building value for your product. Otherwise, what are you doing at this company? And so engineering, it's like actually very empowering, especially because like actually math is like very easily like it's like engineering brain works really well with thinking about like P&Ls. So that's one observation. I think the other thing that I see is it's exactly what you're saying. Like the person who runs finance is they're extremely young, first of all. Like we're seeing like CFOs who I'm like, whoa, like you are like a CFO and you're legit, but you are way younger than like, it's like the meme of a CFO is like you're like this like 80-year-old dude and you have white hair and you're the risk mitigator. And
smells
now
like
what we're
tweed,
seeing is exactly. And now it's like the exact opposite, where it's like they're pushing the risk pedal, and they're smart about it, and they have full control. But because their business model is like so tied to value, it's exactly they're able to like see through actually, oh, because I control both sides, I don't just manage costs. I actually manage upside as well. I can identify here is this, and so what you're seeing is this like compression of like at Dropbox, we'd have like the strat fin org who's all about upside, and then the accounting org that's all about minimizing downside. And now it's like compressed into one human, and that person's very generalist. They're generally very like mathematically inclined, but they look, they're not the accountants anymore. They're not like, they outsource a lot of that stuff. And so in a way, it's actually a much more interesting, super strategic role. And it looks like, and so one of these things that I've observed just is that these people are like, I think at public companies, the CFO is always the right hand, and there's like a reason why the CFO frequently becomes the CEO. At these smaller companies,
they're in the operation stage.
Exactly.
Worried about like like a few points.
And now it's exactly like, to me, it's actually the opposite now. It's like the CFO is like a mini CEO, and it's just like, it's like in the maybe the best possible sense, which is like the possibility space. And they're like, yes, they're managing risk, but they're really there to like see upside.
But to put the finest point on this, I'm going to repeat myself. It is so important. Like this, I've been in this industry for a long time, 25 years, man. I've done 2 companies of my own. I've done over 200 investments. I've seen it all. I've never in my life been in like a 5-person company where you're talking like about like product design. Like you haven't even started the product. Like you're literally talking about like, okay, what are we going to build? Who are we going to build it to? And a key pillar of that conversation is pricing COGS and the finance. I mean, it's the closest we've ever been to delivering direct value and paying direct COGS. And so if it's not pulled way forward, you're probably not giving it the due that it warrants.
I agree, and I think the kind of the company that taught me this lesson super viscerally was when we embedded in Snowflake for a while and just like got to watch that team operate.
Of course.
And they told this story that like has never left my head. This was like 6 years ago at this point, and they were basically like, look, the truth is at this company, engineering, it's like when they're thinking about shipping a feature, they're like, at Dropbox, if you could ship a cost saving feature and just like drop cost by 50% or whatever, you'd have shipped it yesterday. You're like, of course, I'm just going to go book the win. But in these usage-based businesses, the cost and the usage profiles are so deeply related. And so the engineering team, it's like, actually, they have to deeply think about, okay, how does this like cost savings affect our top and our bottom line at the exact same time? And it's like when you have these like tied to value metrics, like, yes, reducing query time against some database is like in theory good, but if your monetization metric is too tightly tied to that thing, then it actually could be negative. And it introduces these really interesting set of incentives. And so you realize that like if engineering can be tweaked in that way, think about sales, think about every other department. Now it's like Snowflake, they have this saying, or at least they did, which was like basically the contract the like sales starts when the contract is signed. They sign a $10 million contract. Now sales starts, because now you need to burn down that contract and actually make sure that like the product is actually getting used. And it's this like NRR based like mindset around like, it's like bookings, who cares? It's like much more about like making sure that it gets consumed. And that is such an alien concept for people who kind of came up during the SaaS era, where like vaporware sales is like just as good as software that actually gets used. And I think this new world is different.
And oh, by the way, this is totally changing orgs. Like it changes like, what is pre-sales versus what is post-sales. It changes what is the customer success org. It changes, how do you incent the teams on these things? Who do they report to, et cetera? So, I mean, the change is kind of as dramatic as you can get. It's everything from product to sales comm to organizational design. And right now, by the way, like I would say, outside of like the researchers that, Mark Zuckerberg is poaching for billions of dollars, like some of the most in-demand people in the industry are post-sales, just because like actually expansion is driving most of the economics of these companies. And so like really,
it also fits it fits your thesis around this idea of like actually, it's like this, like being multi-product, thinking about like, okay, acquisition is maybe not a solved problem, but it's like a much easier problem.
It's a much easier problem now than it has been. Yes, exactly. So it's almost like we've shifted. Like it used to be everything was like, just get people to like get the product. Like it was so hard, man. You like spend,
Yeah.
especially in infrastructure, spend years starving for oxygen, like waiting. And now you basically can get users by subsidizing it, and almost everything in the company strategically. I mean, listen, I'm trying not to be categorical. It's not categorically true, but so much focus has shifted to, all right, you have users, now what? And that's really where a lot of strategic bulk is. Yeah.
Okay, one last question and then I'll jump to Q&A. But as an investor, I guess like what is the biggest like kind of mindset change you've had to make over maybe the past year now that this stuff is like slightly maturing? It's like it's obviously we're like entering the like some amount of stabilization phase. Maybe it's just going to get crazier from here. Who knows? But like, what's your biggest update as an investor as you're like looking at these companies on day one of because you invest primarily at seed, right? So like when you're seeing companies for the first time, like what is the thing that has updated the most for you?
I mean, I just think that we kind of know what's working, and there's areas that's speculative, and I think we just tend to conflate these things. So what do we know that is working? Bringing down the marginal cost of creation to zero is working. And what is that creating? You're creating all sorts of stuff, right? You're creating images, you're creating videos, you're creating stories. So like that, like those companies are really, really working. And we hear a lot of these like whatever that stupid MIT report of like 95% of enterprise things fail. Like, like these just don't make any sense. Like this is a prosumer revolution of like creatives, and there's tons of like, profitable companies at scale in that space. So like that's definitely working, right? Coding is definitely working, right? It just turns out that like, let's say there's 30 million developers, let's say, and there's probably more, let's just say 30 million, let's say they make on average of 100K a year, right? You're talking about a $3 trillion market, and you've got a tool that touches all of them, and you've got multiple products at over $1 billion. I mean, this is a really, really meaningful shift. So we know that's working. There's a less talked about thing that's working, which is like this kind of emotional connection stuff, right? Like some people were kind of grumpy about GPT 4.5 because it wasn't as obsequious as like 4. And so like we do have an emotional connection. We have a bunch of very interesting companies that are kind of doing something computers have not been able to do, is to do that. And so we now have a lot of clarity on things that are working. Language reasoning is working very well. Like if there's a language reasoning task, you can do research, like that's working. But there's things that are still not working, right? And we just conflate these two because like, so again, like, like the MIT, 95%, fail. Probably what's happening there is like, okay, so like so there's some big company and the board is like, we need AI. And then the CEO's like, we need AI. So they go to the platform team, we need AI. And they're like, let's do AI. And then they hired Deloitte. And the Deloitte doesn't know what the hell they're doing, right? So like everybody comes in. I mean, in this new thing, I mean, Deloitte's great. I'm just saying like in this thing. And then they do AI, which of course is going to be a total failure because like, the enterprise is just still trying to figure out how to do this. It's very much a secular phenomenon. It's very much coming from users. There's a shift in user behavior. That means new product. This is an entirely like new super cycle, so you can't look at kind of like enterprise buying. And so I would say my biggest takeaway is like we know what's working. It's this very secular change in user behavior. We know what's still on the come, which is deep enterprise, stuff, and that's kind of where it's at right now. But we know that there's enough momentum that it's going to follow the same cycle as the internet or the browser, where it always starts in the secular way and it goes towards there. And so listen, I think we can say like this stuff is magic. It's working. It's a big, huge wave, but that does not necessarily extend to things where it hasn't matured yet. And we just need to be kind of very sober about kind of where we are in the adoption cycle.
Yeah. Actually, this I said that was the last question, but there's one question I've been meaning to ask you for a long time.
Every time I talk to you, I'm like, let's
no, there's a million more. But this one is, I think it's like, I think one of the things that's striking about you as an investor is you're very consistently, in my opinion, kind of operating at the edge. You're like kind of I know you're in all the discords and all of these weird things. How do you source these new things? Like I can't imagine like you're like taking emails from your inbox. Like what is your algorithm for exploring the edge and kind of consistently finding it?
Oh, I mean, listen, I've got the best team on the planet. I mean, I've got a team of 8 to 10 investors who, I mean, we kind of segment up the world. I mean, the way that we view about the world is, I only focus on infrastructure, and if there's a set of like 2 or 3 good founders in a space, we just view it as it's a viable space. Like if a good founder is going to like risk their, opportunity costs, their, family's wealth on it, it's a good space. And then we use that as kind of an indication of an interesting space. And then we just do all the research. We talk to all the customers, we talk to all the competitors, everything that we can to learn about that space. So we kind of follow the founder network. It requires a team to do that. And then again, we're fortunate to have like a top portfolio that tends to have platforms that a lot of early adopters will use, and so we kind of have like that visibility into this. But it's a very multifarious approach that requires a big team, and then honestly, it's like my favorite thing is innovation and startups. So it's where I spend all my free time too, which helps.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. I'm going to jump to some user questions because there's a bunch of them, and and actually maybe Maggie's going to jump on and start.
Yes. Yeah, we have a ton of questions, so I'm hopping back on. I think there were a couple questions around, I think, Martine, what you said about AI solving the customer acquisition problem. So can you go a little bit deeper there on what you meant by that?
Yeah. So for these models, this is the closest we've ever seen to just exposing a model to the market and then having users that you can actually monetize, right? We just haven't seen this before. There's so many examples, companies going from 0 to 100 million or 50 million pretty quickly. And so if you look at the mean company that's a model company in this space, the problems they have tend not to be like, can you get someone to use it? Like I hate the term GPT wrapper because it's actually not a real thing. It's this weird pejorative people come up with. But let's say you're doing a startup and your startup is like, I'm just going to take GPT and I'm just going to change the website. Like you're doing nothing, but you're like, I've got a website that's doing GPT-5. Like people will use that because it's so magical, right? And you've done nothing. All you've done, right? And so you're basically spending money to acquire users. And so you've got this kind of magical thing that you can expose to acquire users. And now all of the questions come down to, how do you add value on top of the models? How are you defensible? How do you get away from kind of this kind of seesaw problem of model releases and then not being a kind of a frontier model? How do you do defensibility, et cetera? So the problem has really moved from the acquisition problem, which these models tend to solve many times, to kind of the rest of the business.
Cool, great. And then there are a couple questions too around, with shifting to usage-based pricing, how do you think about revenue predictability and forecasting? Maybe a question for both of you.
That's a Scott question. It's a great question.
Yeah. I think it's
a complicated question.
I think it's exactly as complicated as I think the short answer. I think the way that I like to think about this question is, like, every company wants some amount of predictability, but you also want unbounded amount of upside value, right? And so the good thing about usage is that as it grows, like, your value is growing, the value you're providing to your end customer. And so getting to predictability and also like having a value model that scales, like as your customers find value, like it's almost like why, if you're building a product like Facebook and for virality, like you wouldn't really, like, if you found a way to like drive virality through the roof, you wouldn't really question it too much. You'd be like, okay, cool, great. Like this is a really good problem to have. And so what I find is that frequently when companies are asking the predictability question, really they're kind of either worrying about like a fake thing that they haven't yet run into, or they actually have a real version of this where they're actually like trying to manage things really, really tightly, and they have a lot of data. And so the reality of like managing essentially the predictability problem is, it is a problem that isn't really fundamentally solvable in the early phase, and you really shouldn't stress about it too much. Investors will always ask about it because that's what investors do. They're trying to like minimize risk. But the reality is, like, I don't stress about it. And then at the point where you do have like a super highly used product, yes, then it becomes a problem, and now you have the data to be able to go solve it. And it requires like honestly, just a lot of work. And the things you need to get, like, basically, if you just study like growth as a concept and you think a lot about like cohort-based growth, and you get really good at like dialing in kind of very, it's like fairly standard, essentially growth tactics, you can usually get to a model that's like good enough to kind of be like, I can manage my business on this side. Now, sometimes the predictability question comes in the form of customers, where customers are like, I don't really want to have to like, I'm worried about unbounded spend on your platform, which is like a fair concern for a CFO or a budget holder. There, I actually look at this like a product problem. So if you study OpenAI, for instance, when they sign their like super large enterprise customers, they like basically build in product tools to basically limit the amount of money that can be spent at the CFO's discretion. So they can basically say like, look, this user's only allowed to spend $10,000 this month. This user's allowed to spend $100,000. This user's only allowed to spend $1,000. And so what they're doing is they're transmuting this like concern around unbounded spend into a product that actually helps them control spend. And so actually their budget tools, their cost control tools are a core part of their product experience. And so frequently when customer and then that plus like EDPs, which everyone's super familiar with buying from like Amazon and from the hyperscalers, those two things combined, like a product experience plus like a commercial kind of structure, kind of give customers the predictability, like essentially the downside protection that they need in order to feel good about buying. That's generally how I've experienced it, is like almost always like there's a theoretical problem, but in practice it's kind of solved with like fairly straightforward commercial structures and then investment in product resources. And then also just kind of realizing that the flip side of being unable to protect the like your rapidly growing revenue is actually like a business that's growing at an unbounded rate, which is like generally a good, like falls into the champagne problems part of the curve. So I don't know, Martin, if you have a different view, but
no, I think that's great. No, I totally agree.
This is kind of interesting. I think we talked a lot about the SaaS monetization shift. There are a couple of questions on like, if you're a more established SaaS company and you can't move at the pace of SaaS monetization and how it's changing, is there any advice the two of you have there for companies struggling there?
Yes, I actually, the basic answer is like I have like an hour-long talk for boards about this exact conversation that I've given to many public company like C-suites. So the answer is like I will compress it down into like 3 simple recommendations, and then if you like really have this problem, come talk to me. I'm happy to like go bend your ear. So the first thing is to Martine's earlier point, the move from seat-based or let's say you're on a flat fee subscription to usage is bigger than you probably think it is, and it affects every department. And so in order for that to work, it's like a major transformational moment. So the right way to handle this is to deputize someone to basically push this through the organization, because the entire organization is inertially set up to resist this change. Like just straight up, your sales comp won't work, your product development process won't work, your product doesn't work for it. So you actually have to take it super seriously. And if the CEO doesn't care or the board doesn't care, it's not happening, and don't even try. Like that's my first advice. The second advice that I think is really, really critical is start small, but with conviction. So sometimes you see these companies, they try to do this like boil the ocean. Like I'm going to move 5 billion in ARR from a seat-based plan to a usage-based plan in a year or 2. That is never going to work. Like never. And so what you actually have to do, the smart companies, what they're doing is they're launching new AI native products. So they're using it as a brand, like kind of product building moment. And what they're doing is they're starting that product as a $0 product, and they're treating it like a $0 product where they don't know anything about the viral loops or how to sell it or anything like that. And what they're doing is they're planning over time to shift that 5 billion over to like 10 billion on this new usage-based product, but they're doing it over like half a decade. And so they're both like acting with urgency, and they are also like having a stomach that can survive like for the next 3 to 5 years. And if you try to do it too fast, your business will reject it. If you don't treat it like a new product, you try to hold it to the old, like, your like super safe product management philosophy where every change review takes 2 months, you're also going to lose because your competition is AI native and you're going to move way too slow. And so the best companies, what they're doing is essentially they're using it like a little bit of a refounding moment, and they're kind of taking this like AI native product and they're putting like their most enterprising startup aligned like PM or product leader or GM and just saying, here's a budget, just go run at this thing as hard and as fast as possible. And what you will see, by the way, is if you do this right, is that product line will grow as fast as a Cursor or a Lovable. Like I have many different examples of public companies that have launched AI native products that started at 0 in January and are now at 150 million, like a year into, or less than a year into the product. Yeah. Why is that? It's because Martine called, I actually like this frame that Martine uses, which is AI is magic. When you're selling magic, turns out people fucking love magic. Yeah. And you have a distribution channel that is huge. And so it is like you have this back book that you can, like, if you actually do have magic, you can find these viral loops and you can get growth that it like looks like, an AI native startup within this giant context. It just requires, though, that you strip away all the like bureaucratic crap that comes with being a large company. And if you do that, you actually can capture this lightning in a bottle. And there's tons of examples in the wild. Like, I won't name them, but like all the public companies that have this, you can bet they're talking about it in their freaking 10Ks. Like it's like front and center in these things.
I think there's a very important aspect of this to call out, which is the only real sin in this epoch is zero-sum thinking. And I think that a lot of companies are in paralysis because they're like, oh, SaaS is dead. Like, this is going to change. And that's just patently not true. This is a new behavior. It solves a new class of problems. Like, user expectation is going to evolve, but that doesn't mean that these companies are irrelevant, right? And I feel like there's this big explosion, and then a lot of companies are like, wait, I'm still here. I didn't get destroyed. So now they're kind of like coming up with, like, they kind of survived like the first wave of these things. And the reality is listen, AI is not great at system of record. It's not great at transactional guarantees. It's not great at things that traditional compute is really good at. So if you're one of those companies and that's what you do, you have to realize that the user expectation is going to evolve, and you're going to have to evolve with that. There are probably areas of your product that AI is very good at, and you're going to have to evolve to those. But this isn't the existential crisis that I think most people are viewing it as. And so I would just recommend, like, listen, if you're in the stage, do not like succumb to the paralysis of like, oh, all is lost. Realize that you can incrementally do this. I think Scott articulated very well. But like the zero-sum thinking is the worst. Like, it's like, oh, like, this is going to come at the cost of everything we do. It's just the wrong mentality.
I agree. And I think the key thing I've observed is that, like, you can actually, because we sell to a lot of these companies, you can kind of sort them on the first call, where you're like, are you both enterprising and willing to question the status quo, but you're also not like fatalistic. You're kind of like, you're just like, you're in this like mindset of, yeah, we know that there's a huge opportunity for us here. We know that these markets are way bigger than we ever thought they were. And we have the air cover to go do the things that we need to go do. And I think that like balance is pretty rare, but when you see it, you can tell. Like, it's like extremely obvious. And I think the smartest CEOs, they're understanding it now, and they're seeing the positive examples. Like, I think Figma's like been pretty successful on this front, and I think you can kind of see it. And I think the smart CEOs are like, okay, cool, let's just do that. Like, let's copy the playbooks, and the playbooks are being written right now. I don't think anyone has a perfect one yet, but you can start to see it happening. And I think the good thing is a lot of these companies are public, so they're kind of forced to talk about it. And in fact, they love talking about it because it's like pure marketing upside for them.
I think we have time for one last rapid question, but I know both of you talked about like acquisition kind of being unbounded now and the shift towards defensibility. Is there any advice you'd have folks take away on thinking about defensibility, where monetization plays a role in that?
Martine, I'll let you go. I think you thought about this a lot.
Where monetization impacts defensibility.
Just defensibility in general, and if monetization.
So here's the best that we have, which is there's probably, as far as we can tell, no endemic moats in AI that are new, that are like endemic to the technology. In fact, you could argue there's perverse economies of scale because these models get distilled pretty easily, so it's pretty easy for incumbents to catch up, and they're actually very resistant to being layered by software. And so like it's kind of, you expose it directly to the user, and so like users can just kind of move between them without getting locked into a complex workflow. And so like they're almost like defensibility resistant in a way. And so the companies that do defensibility, they actually kind of get very good at more traditional modes. Like I mentioned, two-sided marketplaces, one brand, one is another one. You'll see a lot of these companies actually really lean into brand because, like, in markets are expanding this quickly, it's very important. I say distribution is very much a moat, which goes to the monetization. Like
Yes.
for me, if a company comes in and like we're gross margin negative, and I look at the company and I'm like, oh, 60% of it's positive. They made the decision to go for distribution. I'm like, yeah, I would definitely want to invest and be in that, because like distribution is very much a strategic moat in an early market like this, which is directly tied to it. And then there's just a lot of the enterprise modes. Like a lot of these solutions require understanding the enterprise needs, and kind of the long tails instead of integrations, et cetera. And so I would, if you're an AI company or launching an AI product, I would lean heavily on traditional moats. I'd lean heavily on distribution, which again is, I mean, I think to have the effect of not to do that correctly, especially as you go multi-product, you want to do it usage based. And listen, this is one of these areas we're still learning. So maybe Scott, you and I have this webinar in a year.
Yeah, and things have changed a lot.
We'll update everyone on the data points that we'll collect in a year.
Yeah, I think my belief on it as someone who's like a founder in this space is that, I like kind of fundamentally distrust the concept of moats, in the sense that I think it can be like, it's like it's hard to say that anything in the fullness of time won't get evaporated. But what I do know is doing one hard thing is hard. Doing two hard things is really like two uniquely hard things is impossible. And so if you think you can do it, that is like a really attractive thing for us. And so the way I think about it is, when you're building a product in market, pick a market where your product is disruptive. And if you can find the synthesis of also where the business model is disruptive, then your incumbent is both forced to follow on the product, and they have to update their entire go-to-market motion and their like commercial motion. And so it's why I'm like, obviously I'm a vendor in the space, but like why I think usage is so disruptive, because you're getting a double disruption at the incumbent level, where you're getting disrupted on the product and on the business model. And so you actually have to make two massive changes at the exact same time. And that's just really hard in the inertial context. And so if you're a founder in this space, finding those like soft spots in like the market substructure is just what you will find is that if your competitor is a tech company, they'll probably be able to follow you on product eventually. They'll clone what you're doing, but they'll be so slow on the go-to-market side and on the distribution side, to Martin's point. And I think that's, to me, the magic is like you just do both. And the good thing is you're young, you're early. You can build your company to be usage or consumption native or outcome native. Like you can build all the incentive structures from day one to kind of fit in this like, price to value model. And especially if you're competing against companies that aren't that way, like you can, basically every excess seat that Salesforce sells is your opportunity. Like their margin is your opportunity, very literally, in this space. And I think that like combining the two is actually like the easiest way to build a really massive business and grow really fast. So.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much, Scott and Martine, for the conversation. We still have a lot of Q&A, so we'll follow up with folks we didn't get answers to today, but we have one more webinar in the series with Lovable, so stay tuned for that one.
Awesome.
Thank you, Martine.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Maggie. Bye.
Ciao.